The year is 2005. The Premier League has been dominated by three huge clubs. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, the English League has been conquered by a London club with a Portuguese manager and a Russian owner. Within just 3 years, they had won everything there was to be won in English football. But more importantly, they had changed football forever without even realising it. This change is what we're unpacking today, and I promise you it will change your views on modern day football. You see, 20 years ago, football was simple. Teams got rewarded for, believe it or not, being good at football. And in modern day, that's changed slightly. It's not just about how many clean sheets you can keep or goals you can score, it's also about how many lawyers you can hire and how creative your accountants can get. And it goes far deeper than that, where it seems that modern day football teams are locked in their place while the rich just get richer. But to truly understand how this has gone so wrong, we need to go back in time. You see, these new rules and regulations that seem to be having more and more control on what goes on field actually came from a way to help clubs. In 2009, it was reported that 50% of football clubs were actually losing money. So, in 2009, UEFA sent shockwaves through football when they introduced financial fair play rules. The goal was simple: to stop clubs recklessly overspending on the pursuit of trophies, possibly bankrupting themselves in the process. Portsmouth were a perfect case study. In 2008, they won the FA Cup. The next season, they're playing in Europe. The next season after that, they're in administration. The financial fair play rules officially started in the 2011-2012 season, because the clubs asked for a 2-year grace period to iron out their finances and raise any concerns they might have had. Eventually, it was all agreed and clubs were only allowed to lose 45 million euros across 3 seasons. When UEFA actually began enforcing the financial fair play rules, clubs started to listen. In the first year, only one club was sanctioned, Malaga, and they were actually excluded from European competitions. The following year, bigger clubs like PSG and Man City faced massive fines and had their squad size limited. By the 2014-15 season, it was reported that 4 clubs had lost £25 million in just one season. But there was a much bigger problem. As these rules were set by UEFA, only clubs competing in Europe actually faced any punishment, which meant clubs not competing in European competitions were still taking huge risks chasing trophies. Like QPR, who recorded a staggering £65 million loss in 1 year. So something needed to be changed. And it did. In 2015, the Premier League introduced their own financial rules. You might have heard of them. They're called the Profit and Sustainability Rules, or for short, PSR. They outlined that Premier League clubs were only allowed to lose £105 million across 3 seasons. If you were to look at just the surface level of these rules, they are fantastic for football. They protect fans from their club overspending and potentially going bankrupt and no longer being a club. We've seen it before. It is absolutely the worst thing that can happen to fans. But we need to look at it realistically and the knock-on effects. Immediately, you can jump to the obvious. You get teams like Man City with 115 charges hanging over their head. But that doesn't matter, because it needs to be settled in a courtroom. It needs to be settled 4 or 5 years later. We are still waiting for the decision. But the football leaks are already out. Everyone's seen it for themselves. It is obviously, for any football fan, not acceptable to be paying for your own sponsors and everything else that was attached to that. But now it's too late to really make a decision. You know, can you take back those titles? Can you really punish them for how much they've grown as a club in that time? And what about the fans that are new fans and young fans that just saw a team they really liked because they spent so much money, because they were successful? And now they're going to feel the wrath if they do get these huge long-term fines, which no football fan really thinks they're coming, just because of the size and the longevity and the delay on all of this. And they're not the only club. This isn't a Man City video. Since Todd Boehly took over Chelsea in 2022, they've spent over 1.5 billion euros, far more than any other team. But the biggest kick in the teeth is that if you look at today, they are the club with the best PSR record. Not because of how they've done on the pitch, not because they've done fantastic in other businesses. It's just because of how well their accountants could bend the rules in their favour. They've amortised their contracts across 7, 8, 9 years, so the cost is lower on a short-term basis. But worse than that, the multi-club ownership, where they're selling their women's team to themselves. They're selling hotels and car parks to themselves. And that's given them this huge wage budget and, transfer budget. And you look at other teams competing well on the pitch, like Newcastle, who have the money to spend, and they can't spend it. And if you look back in history, which we already have, it was Chelsea that these rules were set up to stop happening again. And now they are rewarded from these rules again. And this is far from just one problem. There is far many more I'm going to cover. Because at the core of any rule, it's not the rule itself that's going to dictate how clubs act. It's the consequences when you break those rules. And for PSR and financial fair play, the punishments couldn't be less clear. But don't just trust my opinion, let's look at some case studies and you can tell me if you can see consistency and clarity. In 2014, PSG broke UEFA's financial fair play rules we discussed earlier. They did it by overspending and inflating sponsorship deals by tens of millions of euros, and the result was a €60 million fine, of which 40 million was actually suspended. As well as this, they were allowed 4 less players in their Champions League squad and had a spending cap until they balanced their books. In 2022, Juventus also violated the financial fair play rules from UEFA. They were caught overinflating their player transfer profits. So basically, it was a different way to break the same rule as PSG did many years before, but their punishment was that they were banned from UEFA competitions, including the Champions League, Europa League, the Conference League. But it goes one better than that, because in that specific year, they were in the Conference League, which they didn't want to play anyway, so they basically got away with it. And it's not just UEFA, let's also look at some Premier League punishments for breaking PSR. Nottingham Forest breached the rules in the 22-23 Premier League season by £34.5 million. The next season, Forest ended up getting a 4-point deduction, but it didn't really matter because they still stayed up. Compare that to Everton, that were deducted 8 points for PSR breaches. One of the charges was based around interest payments around building their new stadium, which would obviously build future revenues for them. But it didn't seem to matter that the breaches were in different seasons, and they ended up with 8 points in the same season. So although the rulings might have been fair, the way they were applied made no sense either. Especially when we consider the fact that Man City still haven't been found guilty of their breaches or found innocent. But in that time period, every other club can seem to be found guilty or not guilty. So currently, we've covered how the rules can be bent by clever clubs to gain a significant competitive advantage on the rest of the field. When it's concluded that the rules have been breached, there's no consistent or predictable formula for the punishment, but it gets even worse because I think the rules were set up to fail from the start. If you are enjoying, please subscribe to the channel. I'm putting as much effort as I can into educational, enjoyable football content. When you base the rules around profits and you base it around the last 3 seasons, it actually isn't fair or equitable at all. Because those smaller teams that have had that one-off amazing season, the next season, they're literally doomed to fail. They can't go out and spend massively to try and reinforce their team, because the rules are based across the last 3 seasons. And let's say they do get into the big European competitions like the Champions League or the Europa League. They don't have the squad to compete. Most likely their best players will be poached by bigger clubs. But even if that doesn't happen, their squad will naturally be so thin, competing across more competitions against stronger opposition. Heidenheim in Germany is the perfect example of this. In the 23-24 Bundesliga season, they had the season of a lifetime, their highest ever finished. They even won qualification into the Europa Conference League. But in the group stages, they finished 16th, and then in the league, they were so bad they got into a relegation playoff. And it's the same, But the complete opposite for bigger clubs. Look at clubs like Man United that have significantly fell off, are no longer that massive club in terms of on-field performances. But off the field, they can go and buy whoever they want. And Mbuemo's going to Man United. Cunha's probably going to end up at Man United as well. They can just keep spending, trying on these talents. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't seem to matter for them. And that's all because of the way the rules are set up. If you base it on profits over the last 3 seasons, the bigger clubs have more profit to work with. So Man United can keep spending that money. Yes, they still need to be able to fit into the same rules as everyone else, but the numbers are so much bigger. It's so balanced in their favour. And again, you don't need to trust me, you just need to look at the facts. In the last 2 seasons in the Premier League, the 3 newly promoted clubs got instantly back relegated. Southampton were lucky to not break Derby's record for the lowest point score in the Premier League. And for the upcoming season, it's favourites to happen again. And it's absolutely no surprise. Because teams, when they're promoted from the Championship in the EFL, they needed to follow the EFL rules for the previous 2 seasons. For example, let's look at Sunderland. They were in the EFL Championship for the previous 2 seasons, where of course the loss allowance is slightly less, so they could only spend up to £13 million each year. But they're competing against Brentford, Wolves, maybe even Tottenham, of who they could replace rather than getting relegated. So those guys have had a much larger loss allowance each season for the previous 2 seasons. And let's just say Sunderland go out, spend big and try and make it in the Premier League. Well, that's fine. But if they don't, those massive losses get amortised back into the Championship into smaller loss brackets. It would effectively put a massive anchor on the club if they were to go down. And the most interesting part is that pretty much has already happened in the form of Jack Rodwell. So these newly promoted teams come into the league with a worse squad, with less money to spend, with bigger risks if they don't stay up, and people actually want them to try and stay in the Premier League. It's such a huge risk, not just for the league itself, but people are only seeing it happen in the Premier League. But if you look outside, if you look to teams dominating their league, trying to have a chance in Europe, it's exactly the same effect. And overall, the rich will just keep getting richer, whilst the other teams just fail in comparison, and it will make for very lackluster, very one-dimensional football competitions where the big teams can just keep winning and getting richer. And I think the long-term problems of this, people aren't truly realising. If you did enjoy this video, please like, subscribe to the channel and check out my other videos.